Dire post-Brexit shortage of lorry drivers has induced chaos through the British supply chains. Everything from food to fuel has been impacted by these disruptions, and now fears loom over tanker driver shortages, which have led in turn to panic buying, leaving many of the country's pumps dry. Britain has now put the army on standby to help the ongoing fuel crisis to resolve and announcing further measures to help ease the supply chain crisis. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has said in a statement that limited number of military tanker drivers will be put on a state of readiness and deployed if necessary to further stabilize the fuel supply chain. The military drivers will receive specialized training before deploying if the crisis does not ease in the coming days. Panic buying has deepened the supply chain crisis, triggered by a shortage of truckers, and now up to 90% of British fuel stations are running dry across major English cities. Retailers are warning that the situation could batter the world's fifth largest economy. This as desperate motorists queued up at fuel pumps across Britain with draining tanks. Medical bodies have already said that some healthcare staff have struggled to get to work, while schools have warned that online teaching could resume if teachers are unable to reach their classrooms. The agitation has prompted calls for the government to use emergency powers to give priority access to healthcare and other essential workers. There is no respite from long queues outside filling stations as of now, as access to fuel remains a massive worry for most of Britons. Drivers have been queuing up for hours on end to fill their cars at petrol stations that were still selling fuel, albeit often rationed. At other stations, pumps were either closed or had signs saying that fuel was not available. One cab driver searched 9 fuel stations over the weekend before finding one open and queued for more than an hour to fill up.
The last 24 hours has been 3 hours yesterday of driving around with limited fuel trying to find some. I eventually did at the 9th attempt, but I had to queue for nearly an hour and a half to get some, which means that I'm okay for the next day or so, but then it's going to be completely out of my hands. If I can't get anything, then the cab's going to be parked up. People that need fuel need fuel. There's a lot of people out there that don't need fuel and are taking it, and that's causing a knock-on effect to the problem. But an essential users list is what's needed so that the garages can prioritise, and we definitely need to be on that so that we can continue to do our job.
Britain's departure from the European Union in January saw many foreign truckers leave the country. The shortage has now led to empty supermarket shelves and has raised fears about deliveries of food and toys for Christmas. Critics have blamed the UK government's inaction on tackling shortages of lorry drivers. During Brexit, British government campaigned for an end to European free movement, but it's now banking on a short-term visa waiver to plug the gap in drivers. The government has already made a drastic U-turn on tighter post-Brexit immigration policy. Short-term visa waivers have been offered to foreign truckers to help plug the shortfall, and up to 10,500 temporary work visas will be issued to lorry drivers and poultry workers from next month to December 24th. Many have called the move too little too late to avert the food shortages and the subsequent crisis. Our London Bureau Chief Mandy Clark now joins us live on this broadcast from London for more. Mandy, thanks for joining us. Give us a sense of how bad is the situation in the UK right now with massive disruptions, so much so that the Prime Minister has put the army on standby.
It is incredibly chaotic at fuel pumps. I'm at one of the larger fuel pumps. There are queues that snake all around the car park just to get to the fuel pump behind me. There are marshals with high-vis vests making sure people don't queue jump because that has led to fights elsewhere. So there's certainly tensions high amongst the British public. It is a crisis, we're told that there is enough fuel, but it's of course getting that fuel to the petrol stations, and a lot of the public says it doesn't matter if it's HGV drivers. Their experiences, they simply can't get fuel. Now, for the first time, Grant Sharp, who is the Transport Secretary, has finally admitted that Brexit clearly had a factor in this crisis. They have, as you said, put out those essentially temporary visas to entice a lot of those EU drivers who had the HGV license which is a more specialized license than your regular license to drive those heavy goods vehicles, to get them back to Britain. But in all likelihood, we're going to see that only really ease up at the end of October. So there's many weeks to go with shortages, not only at the fuel stations, but also at supermarkets in the shelves.
Right, Mandy, you mentioned Brexit, and I want to delve a little more into that aspect. We know that the pandemic is partially to blame for this crisis, but most say that the true consequences of Brexit are now coming to light. The logistical nightmares are being exposed in a sense. So how will Prime Minister Johnson tackle all this?
Well, in a way, the pandemic was a blessing in disguise for those who pushed for Brexit, because it really hid the issue of transport. People weren't traveling under COVID. Goods weren't moving around as much. But now we're seeing the amount of red tape and difficulty it is to get even goods from the continent to the UK. We're seeing the effect on immigration, because it was those EU drivers willing to work those longer hours at less pay than the British public was willing to do so. And we're seeing that knock-on effect with those drivers simply up sticks and move back. So in many ways, this crisis has been masked because of the pandemic, and it's only really coming to light. There were warning signs apparently in last March that this would be a problem, but it seems that not much is done. And the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, has called Boris Johnson out on sitting on the crisis and not acting quickly enough. So certainly there will be pressure on the Prime Minister to do something about it.
Mandy Clark, our London Bureau Chief, joining us live on this broadcast. Thanks so much for all your inputs. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.